Okay, so let's kick off. You are all so very, very welcome today. Thank you all so much for joining us. I see we have lots more people trickling in. We have popped up a Slido there so that you can answer a few questions for us, and the link for it is also in the chat. My name is Helen Flynn. I am Head of Programs and Partnership at Just Fair, and Just Fair is an organisation that focuses on economic, social and cultural rights. But we also have the absolute joy of co-chairing the One for Equality campaign along with our friends at the Equality Trust. And the One for Equality campaign, it's a whole host of wonderful organisations like some of the ones you're going to hear from today. And we work towards the effective commencement of the socio-economic duty. And I know that a lot of you are public authorities and from local authorities as well. And part of the work that we want to do is to help you when the duty comes in to make it as effective as possible. We are also absolutely delighted to be partnering in this event with the Local Government Association, and we're so delighted to have Carole with us today as part of that. It was really kind of them, and I know the socio-economic duty is something that's really important to them as well. In terms of the layout of the event, we are going to hear from each of our speakers in turn, and then we're going to go to a question and answer session. As I said, we are recording this session, but we're only recording the first part, the speaker presentations, and only the speakers will appear in that recording. Captions are available if you should need them or if you just enjoy using them. And with that, I'm going to stop annoying people and pass over to our first speaker and our partner organisation for this event, the Local Government Association. Councillor Carole Williams is a 5-term elected councillor at Hackney Council, and Carole was first appointed Cabinet Member for Employment, Skills and Equalities in 2016. Her portfolio is broad-ranging. It covers adult learning, volunteering, vulnerable migrants, trade unions, refugees, and also anti-racism work. So Carole, I'm going to pass to you and I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
Thank you for the introduction, and as well as being the Cabinet Member for Employment, HR and Equalities in the London Borough of Hackney, I'm also the Vice Chair of the LGA Health and Wellbeing Board, and that makes me the Labour lead on the LGA for health and wellbeing. So I think they've like you wants to learn a lot from what we've been doing in Hackney. So I have that position nationally. And adopting the socio-economic duty can make a real difference to our communities. We recognise that very, very early on in Hackney. We know that it encourages councils to think about the way that they approach and look at the impact that decision making really has, and for them to really understand how it affects the everyday lives of their residents. Seeing it also offers another lens through which to design our services, and ensures that there is a truly effective and equitable way, an opportunity for us to learn from the places that have already been implementing this effectively in a way that doesn't cause undue burden on the public sector, which we all know is going through significant challenges, particularly financial challenges at the moment. And today, I really hope that we're able to delve into the practicalities of how we can best embed the socio-economic duty into our own work. Hackney was one of the first local authorities in the country to voluntarily adopt the duty. As I do want to share a few experiences as a way of scene setting. It will include some of our experiences, our key outcomes, and how we hope to achieve this by empowering and also empower other councils and other public sector bodies to develop local anti-poverty strategies, and hopefully this will be a way to help with the remainder of today's programme and how you might want to take a decision to do the same in your own local authorities. In Hackney, it really has helped us on our poverty prevention approach. It's helped us to prioritise our own resources, and it helps us to ensure that we're able to develop a strategic approach to child poverty and its wider implications. So it was back in 2013 that we initially voluntarily adopted the socio-economic duty. But then again in 2018, we embedded it within our equalities plan. So this has been an ongoing and iterative process, the way that we work across the council to embed it. And there's been three main reasons for us doing this work. We want to address the inequality caused by socioeconomic background, which is often at the root cause of disadvantage. We recognise that poverty and low income status are key drivers to poor outcomes in health, as well as education, housing, and also in employment. And we are committed to treating socioeconomic status as if it were a protected characteristic, integrating it into all of our decision making, our policy, and our strategy development. So the socio-economic duty underpins the voluntary adoption of the socio-economic duty, underpins our poverty reduction framework, which we've been working on for a number of years. There are 3 cabinet members who lead on all of our poverty reduction work across health, across finance. Our lead on children was our mayor, who's now been elected as mayor. So we're in the process of bringing on one of our cabinet members who leads on children and special educational needs and disabilities. So this is a whole systems approach that we have in Hackney. It is embedded throughout our decision making, our culture, and all of our equality impact assessment, which are routinely include the socio-economic duty disadvantage, and we use it to assess whether residents can be further disadvantaged by low income, insecure work, poor housing, or educational attainment. And it influences policies, including everything from how we fund community partners who work with low income residents. We use it to develop our economic development strategy, which was it was put out to consultation this month. And we use it as part of our distribution of the Household Support Fund, which we distribute to organisations working with residents who are in poverty. And it's also part of our Here to Help team, and they're there to help maximise incomes for our residents. So that is just a glimpse of some of the areas which we use it, but it's not a full list. And the approach is really effective in Hackney, and it is adopted from the leadership right across the council, including the mayor, cabinet, as well as our corporate leadership team. It's the way that we tackle poverty and inequality. It is a political priority for the organisation. It is a mayoral priority. So the entire council works toward alleviating and reducing poverty for our residents. And I have been named the lead member for poverty and inequality. Therefore, just underscoring the need for political leadership on this and signalling that not just within the council but out with as well. It also ensures that there is accountability from across the organisation. It makes sure that we ring fence our resources for this work, particularly during the difficult time of budget constraints. So that's a quick overview. Throughout the webinar this afternoon, if there's any more information or questions that you've got based on anything that I've said, I'd be more than happy to respond. And I really hope that it sets the scene and helps you recognise and understand how, as public authorities, we're able to adopt the socio-economic duty before it's enforced and it comes in, how you can start thinking and preparing for it, how to take a whole systems approach and work across the senior leadership team of your organisations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Carol, and what a wonderful start. I think it'll be really interesting when Laura Burgess speaks in about 5 or 10 minutes to see how many of those boxes that Hackney are already ticking from the practical steps. But before we get to Laura Burgess, I am absolutely delighted to, and sorry, I should say thank you so much, Carol, for being with us today. I am delighted now to introduce Vanessa Boon. Vanessa is the Senior Project Officer leading on the Socio-Economic Duty at the Equality Trust. She delivers training to local authorities and community stakeholders on the duty and has also delivered parliamentary briefings and workshops for academics on the subject following her 2-year participatory research project on the duty's implementation. So I'm going to pass over to you while I smoothly get up the slides.
Thank you so much, Helen. Yes, I'm at the Equality Trust, where we have a mission of dismantling inequalities of income, wealth and power. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to the socio-economic duty. But I hope you'll leave some juicy questions for me to answer later in the Q&A. So feel free to pop those on the chat as we go through, everyone, and we'll pick them up a little bit later. So an introduction to this duty, a bit of background is really helpful to connect to its purpose and its meaning and its potential impact to really make a difference for our communities. So take us back to 2009 to 2010. There were key items of research and public reports at this time that were really highlighting socioeconomic inequalities across the country and their harsh consequences, spanning the health gap, life opportunities, and differences in both quality and length of life, and also for wider society. So amongst those key publications that were informing the thinking at that time when the socio-economic duty was then developed include a book that's close to our hearts at the Equality Trust, because our co-founding patrons, Professors Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, published The Spirit Level. Lives on the bookshelf of many a social justice change maker for sure. So this really provided that evidence base of so many things that we all know were wrong about society and where there are unfair gaps for life chances from day of birth and what postcode you're born into. But this really gave us the evidence base behind it and really informed the thinking as a bestseller and informed policymakers at the time. Another key report was the famous Marmot Review in 2010, Fair Society, Healthy Lives. And this made a really strong link between wealth and health. And that the start you get as a baby in terms of health, nutrition, warmth at home, if you can afford to put heating on in the winter, really affects your longer term experiences of health and well-being. So again, this was a key report that was influencing the thinking as this socio-economic duty came to being. Also a report called The Anatomy of Economic Inequality in the UK by Hills and the team. And these reports then influenced something called the Discrimination Law Review. Some of you may remember taking part in the consultations back then, as I did at the time. And this was reviewing all the separate pieces of legislation we had previously on race, disability, and so forth, and brought them all together into a single Equality Act in 2010. But for the very first time in our country's history, the socio-economic dimension was included. And next slide, please, Helen, thank you. But not only was the socio-economic dimension included, it was the very first section of this Act of Parliament. It is Section 1 of the Equality Act of 2010. So in brief, what does it say? What does it mean? It says that government and local authorities, when making strategic decisions, such as setting your 3- and 5-year plans, setting policies and budgets, must give due consideration to how to deliver in a way that is designed to reduce the inequalities of outcome which result from socioeconomic disadvantage. And I've highlighted inequalities of outcome as equality law nerds such as myself will be well aware that prior to this, most discrimination legislation focused on equal access or opportunity, but this focus on outcomes really shifts that thinking to making a difference. So a brief timeline of what happened after that Act of Parliament was passed. It was passed before a start date was set for it. So the law was passed under the Labour government at that time in 2010. There was then a general election, and in Westminster we then saw the coalition government come to power, and they announced that they would be abandoning this duty. However, it wasn't repealed, but it simply remained dormant on the statute books in Westminster. However, the Government of Scotland got the job done and activated it in 2018 with the Fair at Scotland Duty, and Wales did likewise in 2021. This year, we saw some long-awaited progress in Westminster, launching a public call for evidence or consultation on implementing a socio-economic duty across the UK government and all local authorities in England. We responded to that consultation, and we'll share that link with you. You might want to have a look at. We are now hearing in terms of commencement, it's looking like in 2026, we're expecting to see draft statutory guidance out for consultation in spring next year, and commencement will then follow. We're hearing probably late 2026, but we need to keep up momentum to make sure that times do not slip back. However, nobody needs to wait for a law to do the right thing, and over 40 councils across England have voluntarily adopted this duty as good practice for their local communities. So overall, what this means in a nutshell, it's about shifting issues of poverty, socioeconomic inequality, and class struggle from a social concern that has typically been presented in an individualized way due to personal misfortune or even failure, and with charitable sticking plasters as a response, and instead shifting that to a proactive, preventative, legally required, systematic consideration to make a difference. And I think that's something to get excited about. So having talked about the what, we're going to move next to the how. Thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much for that, Vanessa. That was wonderful. And I particularly loved nobody needs to wait for the law to do the right thing. That's something I'm going to take with me. What a wonderful quotation. Going to move swiftly on because our next speaker is another great one. Laura Burgess is Head of Policy and Research at Resolve Poverty, a not-for-profit organisation that supports local and regional government and their partners with strategic responses to poverty. Resolve Poverty have supported voluntary adoption of the Socio-Economic Duty in local councils, particularly in Greater Manchester, where 90% of councils have adopted the duty. So I'll hand over to you, Laura.
Thanks, Helen, and thank you, Vanessa, for that really good background to the socio-economic duty. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk through the practical steps for implementation of the duty, largely within local authorities, but these principles can be used across the public sector, really. These 6 steps on the screen now are taken from a guide that was produced by ourselves at Resolve Poverty and Just Fair and was endorsed by the whole of the One for Equality Coalition. And embedded within this slide is a link to the full document, which you can access, because I think we are going to send these slides out. And I think we've got it in a resource list at the end of the slide deck as well. And you'll find it on the Just Fair and Resolve Poverty websites. So I will keep this quite brief because we've got lots of really good speakers that you want to hear from, but there is a lot more detail in the document, so please do access it. So the first step then in implementation of the socio-economic duty for local authorities is formal incorporation of socio-economic disadvantage into equality impact assessments. Now I know another One for Equality colleague, Ali, is going to talk a little bit more about equality impact assessments, but really what this means is sort of incorporating socio-economic disadvantage alongside the 9 protected characteristics. What it doesn't mean is regarding socio-economic disadvantage as an additional protected characteristics, but paying due regard in a way that complements existing requirements under the Equality Act 2010 and the Public Sector Equality Duty. The next step is the effective use of data as a tool for decision making and accountability. So I'm sure coming from lots of local authorities, you know how useful data is, and there's an absolute wealth of data that's being collected. Data has an important role to play in supporting and guiding decisions. And in this regard, looking at the socio-economic duty in particular, we should be considering what types of data local authorities are collecting. So quantitative data, numerical data, but also not overlooking the importance of qualitative data, people's stories and their lived experience testimony on the implementation of the socio-economic duty. So making sure that that is something that continues sort of post-implementation and during the monitoring phase. Using data to develop metrics of success is really crucial. The metrics of success will differ by area. We know that poverty impacts different areas and has different drivers across the country in different ways. But it's important that the impact of the socio-economic duty can be understood, monitored and measured so that during the monitoring phase, which I'll talk about in a minute, local authorities are able to look at what's worked and what hasn't worked and actually adjust approaches if need be. Also using data to develop mechanisms so that public bodies can be held to account through the lens of the duty. So with budget setting, as an example there, you know, that's a key role of council leadership is setting budgets and doing that in a way that, you know, consideration of people who are experiencing socio-economic disadvantage is considered. So the next step in terms of socio-economic duty adoption is leadership. So as Helen mentioned, we support public bodies with their anti-poverty sort of strategies, and we talk about the importance of leadership quite a lot across all our anti-poverty work. Leadership is really important for sending a clear signal both internally to an organisation but externally to other partners, to the public sector, to voluntary partners, but also to residents, that poverty is a priority for this local authority and that people experiencing socio-economic disadvantage will be considered at all levels of output and operation of that local authority in this case. So leadership really means buy-in and enthusiasm from all levels of leaders, both elected members and officers, and Carole mentioned this in Hackney, that this has been important with the mayor, and supporting staff to understand what the socio-economic duty means for their role and what it can achieve, whether that's through training, which we can provide, and so can our colleagues at the Equality Trust if you're interested in that, but also, you know, holding sessions and making sure that staff really understand what this is and what this means. The next step in implementation is engagement with people with lived experience of poverty. Now, I think a lot of people would argue this is the most important part of this, which is why I'm not really going to touch on this, but my colleague Tracy is going to cover this off in the next few slides. So I will now move on to talking about engagement with residents and the wider system. So collaborative engagement should take place from the outset of socio-economic duty adoption. And in this sense, really what we're talking about are people who have the lived experience of poverty, as Tracy will talk about, but also other residents and council partner organisations such as the VCSE sector, the voluntary and community sector. So in this space, really, we're focusing on building awareness of the socio-economic duty among partners and creating opportunities for meaningful participative, that's a difficult word to say, apologies, consultation with communities and considering structures, more permanent structures for people with lived experience of poverty to inform and shape policy. And again, I think Tracy will touch on this in a lot more detail than me. The final step really in effective implementation, and I know I've sort of rushed through these quite quickly because of time, and I don't want to just say, oh, it's a quick tick box exercise. It's not. There is a lot more detail that goes into each of these elements. But the final step that we need to talk about is ensuring access to justice and monitoring impact and compliance. You know, with anything like this, we have to be realistic that sometimes a local authority may fail to comply with the duty wholly. And so in anticipation of that, mechanisms must be developed in case this happens. And in addition, you know, regular monitoring should take place to consider compliance internally, but also to measure impact. And this is where the data and developing of metrics of success comes in, because it's important that change results from the adoption of the duty, and those changes are logged and acted upon if the changes aren't necessarily the intended outcomes, and there needs to be a sort of a refocus on impacts. So as I say, that was a really quick whistle-stop tour of the implementation advice. There is loads more in the document, so please do go and read it, and we will be able to answer questions. And I'll pass back to you, Helen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And as Laura said, that is a great guide, and that was a really excellent rundown of what's included in it. But to focus in on that number 4, the lived experience engagement, we wanted an expert to speak to you, and I don't think there's anybody better than Tracy Harrington. And Tracy has worked alongside disadvantaged communities and lived herself in poverty. This has brought with it a wealth of lived and learnt experiences of poverty and socioeconomic disadvantage. Currently, Tracy is the manager of Thrive Teesside and coordinator of the national collaboration known as Poverty to Solutions. Her work has advanced and spearheaded approaches and mechanisms whereby local people have the potential to influence decisions that impact on their lives. So I'll pass to you, Tracy, and I'll switch this slide.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks for the introduction, Laura. Before that, obviously I've got 5 minutes to do the how-to, which is really a challenge in this space, isn't it? So I'll do what I can in the 5 minutes. Usually the how to involve people with lived experience is quite challenging, but to ensure the meaningful implementation of Section 1 of the Equality Act, if this step is missing, if this involvement is not considered from the onset, it may not do what it's intended to do by the spirit of the law. So I urge you, if after this 5 minutes I've done a whistle-stop tour and you want to know more information or a little bit more conversation, please contact me. So I would start off by saying, like I said, the how is very challenging. It's not about, you may have some engagement strategies in your local authority area. You may have some really great connections, and you may have some panels that do influence the way that local decisions are made. And I would say that, first and foremost, sometimes it's worth considering mapping out what you've already got out there, but maybe thinking about an independent body or organisation that can establish, facilitate and support a network of local people. Sometimes your VDA can do this, and they do have very good connections within communities, and sometimes they have them connections but may not have the skill or the expertise around a participatory approach. You must appreciate that this takes time, resource and skills, and understand that this is not just an engagement strategy, a focus group or a consultation exercise. And I think that's why sometimes give yourselves a little bit of time to work with the knowledge and expertise within your community in order to see what assets and skills are there already before you embark on something else. We do have a number of principles around it. We recognise that knowledge about socioeconomic disadvantage is held by communities who have lived experience. So sometimes decisions are made with all the best intentions in the world, but they don't have the desired outcomes that's intended. So recognise that it's another area of expertise that can inform a debate to lead to fairer outcomes and better solutions for people. You need to understand that meaningful involvement is not about gathering 1,000 stories, which sometimes people fall into that trap, somebody's lived experience or lived reality is emotive in that moment, and it can lend itself to a debate. But what we needed to do is organisations and local authority areas need to think beyond the individual, that's the anchor, to then see how does this impact on our people around them, is there a wider reference group? And I think what we need to also do is accept that real success, I'll say that again, comes when there's a bringing together a different area of expertise. We're not saying lived experience of socioeconomic disadvantage is the only area of expertise needed in any debate or discussion. You need policy workers, you need statisticians, I can't even say that word either. You need other areas of expertise that can inform a full debate that can lead to the solutions. I think the other tip that I would give to people as well is it's not just the implementation of the duty, and it lends itself to some of the points that came up earlier on. It's about how do we monitor is it having the desired impact that it was supposed to? Is it taking due regard? Is it really doing what it says on the tin? I said, so people need to be involved on the long journey, and they need to know that right to reply as well when things aren't going wrong. And I think the only other tip at this moment in time, because of time, I would give is ensure when there's an independent body or organisation that can establish it, that it is fully resourced and supported by the public body, the local authority or what other public body wants to do this, because then if not, there is no accountability. There is lots more things I could say. We've all talked about, and I will give you a couple of top tips. We've all talked about the value of this, but sometimes just having some of these tips about getting to know your community, seeking support from others, facilitating them structured discussions to explore how local people and organisations want to connect, what support and resources needed, what would a community decision forum look like, and allow the time to do this. when you engage and connect and get to know the wider community, you need to go to them sometimes. Nobody wants to come and sit around a table in a formal meeting room to have a debate about, you know, local transport issues sometimes. Sometimes you need to go to them to gather that insight. You need to think about the language that you're using and listen, and I think the biggest tip is not jump to the solution, because what tends to happen is when people have engaged in a conversation and when there's a range of expertise in the room, people might say, oh, well, I know the answer to that. If let the solution come from the conversation that's happening. And I do think it's about giving incentives and thank yous. The incentives, you've got to value that insight and that information, because that's an area of expertise that normally would be disregarded. And I think, so remove any barriers to participation. And I have very, very quickly not gone into any detail about any of that. So please contact me afterwards and I would happily explain it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tracy, and absolutely an expert seminar on something you have built absolute years and if not decades exploring. I'm going to pass on quickly because of time to Ali Harris. Ali joined Equally Ours as Chief Executive in 2015, and she started her career in asylum rights and has over 25 years of leadership experience in championing people's equality and human rights for organisations including Oxfam, Stonewall, Citizens Advice, as well as through grassroots community organising. Ali has led work to tackle hate crime against Black and racially minoritized people, LGBT plus people and disabled people for over 20 years. And I'm so delighted to introduce Ali to speak to us about how the socio-economic duty links in with the public sector equality duty.
Thank you so much, Helen. I wasn't expecting you to read all of that. That's a bit embarrassing. But Equally Ours is the national network. It's far more important than my bio. Equally Ours is the national network of equality and human rights organisations. And a lot of our members are small grassroots led by and for, and big led by and for organisations, and we ourselves are a led by and for organisation across a range of equality issues. And I'm, as Helen said, I'm going to touch briefly today on how the socio-economic duty links with the public sector equality duty. And I'm sure lots of people in the room, there's so many people who have a huge amount of expertise on this. So I'm just going to try and summarise some key points. So the public sector equality duty, the general duty, which is part of the Equality Act, requires duty bearers, decision makers to have due regard to the need to eliminate the whole range of unlawful actions under the Equality Act, but that's primarily discrimination and harassment. The need to advance equality of opportunity and to foster good relations. And that duty is supported by a range of specific duties in terms of how to meet compliance. Within England, Scotland, Wales, those are different duties. But there are sort of a minimum that needs to happen, not a maximum. And as I think we heard from Carole today, there's those specific duties that they're helpful, but they're not the be all and end all in terms of implementation. There are some key differences to flag between the public sector equality duty and the socio-economic duty. So the public sector equality duty applies to all decisions, including day-to-day operational decisions and strategic decisions, while the socio-economic duty only applies to strategic decisions. And I think that's a really important thing to understand at all levels within duty bearer organisations, both in terms of what you're trying to achieve, but also in terms of use of joint impact assessments, so that important things don't get lost. And there are other differences as well. So in terms of the public bodies covered, so the PSED covers education providers and the police, and the socio-economic duty at the moment does not. I think there are massive opportunities, and we know this from the research that's been done into how the duties operate in Scotland and Wales, and where there's been voluntary adaptation in England, to use the public sector equality duty and the socio-economic duty together to really tackle where there's an intersection of structural discrimination or structural inequality related to race or disability, age, any of the protected characteristics under the Equality Act, and socioeconomic disadvantage, because we know, don't we, that often those things go hand in hand, but they may present slightly differently for communities depending on whether the challenges around socioeconomic disadvantage that they experience are then exacerbated by racism or homophobia or whatever it might be. So it's a real opportunity to look at that and to see where whether there are those intersections and where the disadvantage is most combined and cumulative and profound, and to make decisions based on that full picture. We've heard how leadership is really key, and that applies to both duties and is worth saying time and time again, as is a focus on achieving improvements and outcomes for communities in their broader sense. And to that end, I would just say that impact assessments, whether done separately or as joint assessments, are really, really helpful, but they're also not the be all, and they're essential, but they're not the be all and end all. And sometimes we see that there's a focus on that process in a way that's about trying to mitigate negative outcomes rather than eliminate them, which is what the duty in combination should be about, but sometimes there's a focus on those sort of processes rather than the leadership. What can we really achieve at a strategic major level, through this? And then the final thing that I will just say now is that I think both duties are really important tools to sit underneath and support and help work out strategies around building community resilience to all the types of extremism that we're seeing and the impact of that. But we know that public sector bodies are already doing this in some places, particularly where the far right are organising to, in a very concerted way, misdirect communities' dissatisfaction and anger around and dissatisfaction with democracy and politicians and democratic processes, and misdirecting that against specific communities, whether that's through Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and all of those other things that we have seen tragically played out recently. And I think there is a real role for engagement. So what a lot of speakers previously have talked about, the importance of engaging with communities across the piece and providing spaces for communities to come together and to talk about what they're experiencing and their concerns and their issues, for communities to be heard. And that's an alternative, constructive place for them to be heard by decision makers and by authorities, instead of the places where they're getting drawn into, which are, as we say, increasing hostility and tensions and violence within our communities. So I think, one thing to take away is really that the two duties together can really be tools to help you to do that. To increase participative democracy and to build community resilience. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that, Ali, and such a timely and important reminder. We are going to kind of circle back to where we started from. You've heard from a whole range of speakers who are part of the One for Equality campaign, but now we're going to circle back for our last two speakers to some practitioners, some people who are actually carrying out the duty on the ground, because we thought that would be really useful for this audience. So firstly, I'm delighted to welcome Councillor Laura Murtha, who's an independent councillor. Laura is the Equality and Human Rights Champion at Falkirk Council and has been an elected member for 8 years now. Active in politics since 1997 and a member of the Scottish Parliament staff, Laura is a passionate campaigner on environmental, equalities and social justice issues. And Laura previously held the portfolios of public protection and education as well as various national equality roles. So over to you, Laura.
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for having me along. And as mentioned, I'm going to be sharing some insights on how we can embed and combine everything that we've just heard about equality and socioeconomic considerations into the strategic decision making. And although I come from this from a Scottish local authority perspective, I hope that our learning here since Fairer Scotland Duty was introduced can be valuable to you as you go on. And I think what I want to do is just sort of say a few words about where I am in the country, which is in Falkirk. And you may not have heard of it, but I suppose it's in the news for all the wrong reasons at the moment. It's basically Scotland's equivalent of your Epping Forest right now. And we are kind of smack bang in the middle of Scotland's central belt and includes the port of Grangemouth, which until recently had Scotland's only oil refinery. And we've lost hundreds of jobs in the last few years and have been hit hard by that cost of living crisis. So just as what was being said just a few moments ago, that doesn't help community tensions and divisions. And that makes that landscape for decision making really, really challenging. And we've also got one of the biggest budget deficits in the country as local authority for lots of complex reasons. But I think that's a really important backdrop when we're talking about the reality of public sector equality duty and the socio-economic duty implementation, and how we need data and evidence-led aspects to drive our political decision making. So, as was mentioned, there's this current pushback, shouldn't we abandon all this equalities nonsense? And straight up, we cannot ignore that as a political backdrop. And we all know, the kind of actors, Trump, Musk, Farage, but it's many in the traditional political mainstream, as well as the far right, that have pushed this issue into the public consciousness. And effectively what they're being told is that this is all a waste of money, and we should not be wasting our breath on this woke nonsense. But ironically, it's those in need of the most protection under the socio-economic duty who are being mobilised to push back against this diversity and equality. So we need to reframe that narrative, and we need to be aware of reframing that narrative. We have to convince them that it is the socio-economic duty, and in many cases hard-working equalities officers who they want to get rid of, who are saving their services and safeguarding them from further poverty. So I've just kind of highlighted that within the slides, and I'm happy to share these later. But we have to start from that truth point of view that the UK is not...
Laura,
Sorry?
You're not sharing your slides currently. I don't know if you want me to share them for you, if that would be easy.
Are they not sharing? Oh my goodness. Okay, let me just go back then and share them. Hopefully that made sense to you guys when you're...
It absolutely did. I just thought you were doing an introduction before you started sharing your slides.
No, what we'll do is I'll go back to sharing them. We were this early and it did work, but it didn't work. Does that work now?
It will work in a second. It's coming up. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. So as I said, not going to go back over that, but yeah, we need to highlight that. We need to highlight that response. So just to go on, we have to start with that truth about the UK not being an equal society, and we need to see, we see the visible inequalities, the poverty, the underemployment and poor health, but many of those remain hidden, and we still have those unequal pay for women, and transport barriers for disabled people, and the cultural assumptions that limit, for example, ethnic minorities accessing childcare, etc. So we have to reframe as well to that equality, meaning everyone having that opportunity to thrive, but disadvantage is often systemic. It's not often intentional, but it's deeply harmful. So I just want to move on to this slide, which I hope you can see, and I'm kind of hoping lots of people nod that they know this slide well and this graphic well. But moving on to understanding equality, not just being about this sort of fairness in principle, but about removing the barriers that limit people's real opportunities, and dispelling that myth that is about treating everyone equally and treating everyone the same. And we have to break that down, so that we can go on to very bluntly dispel that woke argument and that DEI label, and have those less negative attitudes, because what I feel certainly in the socio-economic duty provides much more opportunity for this, is that people are more likely to respond to arguments about poverty and socio-economic duty than they are about some of the other equalities issues. So I think it's a real opportunity in that regard, highlighting the difference between the reality and the equality, equity, justice model. So I'd encourage you all to really do that. I'm just having a, but yeah, I mean, I think in summary, it's about culture change. That's what it's about, and it's about affecting those attitudes. I'm not going to go over socio-economic duty, but just to say Fairer Scotland duty is in essence what you've now got and coming forward and in England, and that's great to see. But I just want to highlight how much of a work in progress it still is for us. You know, it did come in April 2018, and you know, there are many councils who are doing really well in that, but it is still, for many, they're struggling to move beyond that tick box exercise, and I'll be blunt about that. So making it real in that cultural decision making, not being a compliance task, we still have a lot to learn, and I hope that you will be able to learn from the struggles and some of the obstacles that have happened already in Scotland, and obviously those who've already adopted it where you are. But it needs to be, in order to be effective, it requires, as you've heard, leadership. It requires strong focus on data gathering and analysis. And again, above all, as I've highlighted, cultural change is what it needs, but it needs that consistency of application. But others have talked about that already. And it is designed to complement, as we've just heard, the public sector equality duty. It is different. But as we all know, we've had a decade or more, 15 years of public sector equality duty in effect, and we can see that the application of it is still mixed. And one thing I want to highlight is that legal challenges are rare, but that doesn't mean that breaches aren't happening. They are. But because disadvantaged groups often lack the resources to pursue those breaches, then they don't challenge them. And that's a really serious flaw in a system which is meant to protect the most vulnerable people. And we need to be aware of that. It undermines the law's purpose effectively. So we've heard about, you know, it's, you know, what the socio-economic duty is from others. But one thing that's really important is to highlight the intersectionalities that magnify the equalities in socio-economic duty. You know, when we have no alternative but to cut bus routes, those costs are not felt by the people who've got 3 Audis in the driveway in Band H homes, regardless of what other equalities aspects they have, but they are felt by, for example, the compound situation of, you know, women who are struggling to find childcare, and, you know, there are many other things which intersect. So I think particularly from disabled people, ethnic minorities, those people do experience higher rates of socioeconomic disadvantage, and that's generational. It can be cross-generational, and we need to, I think it's, although it's not always the case of doing these combined assessments is the be-all and end-all, they are really important in understanding combined decision making. So I just want to highlight that point as well. My number one take, before I move on to Falkirk specifically, my number one take is absolutely impact assessments, and I do see that the importance of a combined impact assessment. They can't be a tick box or add-on exercise, but we hear that constantly. I'm fed up hearing it. But if you don't do it from day one, and you don't do it right at the start of any kind of proposal, then that's what they'll be. And the reason they need to be done at day one is you need to be asking those questions about who will the proposal affect, what are the implications under public sector equality duty and the socio-economic duty. Do we need a detailed assessment or do we not? And what evidence do we have for whether we do or we don't need it? What sort of evidence do we need? Where are the gaps? Who do we consult with? And assess impact in a meaningful way that will be intersectional. What strategies do we need to employ? And where do we get the expert help to do that? And that's before you think about the evidence and what mitigations are possible and whether recommendations need to change. If you start that process at the sort of decision pre-meeting stage, it's so far too late. It will only ever be a tick box exercise. So embedding that holistic equality process from day one, that's what we have to do to ensure it's meaningful and not mechanical. And I just put up a wee slide of like, what does our EPI look like? And I mean, obviously not zooming in, but who, you know, there's that kind of like, who reads these, right? But but that's totally wrong, and we have to get to a situation where everybody understands it's their responsibility to understand that data and to get comfortable with the different sections of those data. And that's only going to come through repetition and training and giving people confidence. But the groundwork has to be done first about why it's important. So, yeah, how do you make that work in practice? I always say, and I'll put my graphic being a pest, you have to be a pest. You need to be a strategic pest, but you absolutely have to be a pest. Change is not going to come unless everybody is on board. You can't just have one or two excellent equalities officers or one elected member who really cares about it. If you're waiting for them to act, it's not going to happen. So it has to be strategic. It has to be across all departments in your decision making. And until it's everybody's responsibility, it's not going to work as a duty. So I want to just very briefly kind of put on context about Falkirk. And as I mentioned, we've got this huge budget deficit and huge financial pressures. But the challenge we had at budget time is how do we meet our obligations under Socio-Economic Duty and PSED? How do we meet those in a way that has that, ultimately we have a legal obligation to balance the budget, and if that falls, well, all bets are off as to the impact it will have on our constituents. But the experience we had shows why the data does matter and why these duties matter. And it told us that the cuts would harm the most vulnerable. And we had to make that hard choice to raise council tax. And it wasn't popular, but 15.6% council tax rise was the highest percentage in Scotland. But it was necessary. And the reason it was necessary is because the alternative cuts disproportionately affected children and families. And we were able to see that and to see where the gaps in inadequate data, and I'll come on to that, where there was inadequate equalities assessments and poor consultation and a lack of mitigating planning. That was crucial in saving those services. So we rejected 6 out of 7 proposals specifically because they didn't meet public sector equality duty. And I just want to, this part that I'm highlighting here, that's where that transparency is so important. So if you look at where the big arrow is, this is from the sort of final section of our EPIA, which just shows that our own teams were clear that we did not meet public sector equality duty. We did not do enough work to demonstrate compliance. We did not do enough work to assess impact. And that meant that these proposals, which affected mostly children and those who had specific protected characteristics and those in poverty, that we couldn't be sure what that impact would be, and that was really important. So I just wanted to pull that out and show you that is only happened because of the empowerment and training of our officers. And what we also did was this cumulative EPIA. So this is from our budget document, where this big arrow here shows basically where we're looking at the socio-economic duty and where the negative impacts are, and the rest of the protected characteristics. But it enabled us to look at holistically, including down here the council tax at the bottom. It allowed us to look at all the proposals and make that kind of weighing up assessment about what would have the least impact overall and where we could look at mitigation. And that was really important when we came to looking at the detail of, for example, what we knew in terms of mitigation and council tax reduction. But these pieces of evidence need to be really clear and transparent in order that we can make the case to the public. I did these are from what is my FAQs document as a politician, so I'm not going to highlight them too much, but I just wanted to sort of show why the transparency with the public is so important, because the backlash may have been fierce, but the outcome was right, financially and ethically. And families told me that the decision saved their jobs and in some cases saved their way of life. Children wrote to me to express their thanks, and even they sent me handmade gifts and things like that. And it absolutely made me cry. And it would make you cry too. And I can't say a lot about that on camera, but it showed the power of evidence-based, equality-led decision making. And these are just sections from my FAQ document where I explained to people what the issues were with the equality poverty impact assessments, and that was important, and trying to illustrate why it was important to those people who felt maybe they were going to be negatively affected. And the response I had to that was actually fairly positive of those who kind of had that engagement. So what I'd say is that it showed that the legislation alone isn't enough. What we needed was, we needed to have the across department, across councillors, buy-in, champions on both sides, both elected members and officers, to be able to bring this clear data analysis and clear risk analysis. So I've highlighted some of these cuts within my document about what they were, and again how the red flag, as I put it, about not meeting compliance being as powerful in a way of sort of, it's a bit of a paradox, but it enabled us to really look at whether we should or we shouldn't be doing something, and that was a vital part of the narrative in kind of cutting off that anti-woke movement. What we saved was, we saved units for autistic children, we saved nursery places, we saved people's jobs, we saved homeschool transport. These were things which were really, really important to the very people who were speaking up to say, don't put our council tax up, but they themselves were protected from the rise. And that's what I did in this kind of graphic, where I'm saying, look, this is what we saved, and this is in effect what it cost you. So that transparency, you need to empower your politicians as well, and your council staff to be able to make that case, or else these kind of courageous actions, they're not going to happen. So yeah, the agreed budget motion included a very large section about equalities and about the failings that we had in equalities, and that was included within the FAQ's document as well. But it was important that while we have come a long way, we've 15 years of public sector equality duty and 7 years after Fair Scotland duty, and you have a council as committed as this, but this is what we came to in a budget. We said, it's not good enough and we need to do more. So that's, I want to highlight that as a sort of both good and bad aspect about what you can do if you really engage with your socio-economic duty with this. And just finally, that's the thing that we learn. We learned that strong assessments versus poorer ones, that data analysis shaped better outcomes for people. And it enabled that political courage. It enabled the use and the discussion of the biggest issue in our budget of hundreds of millions of pounds was about public sector equality duty and Fairer Scotland duty. That in itself was remarkable. So yeah, you need that evidence base in order to deliver those fairer decisions and sustainable results. And yeah, that's really where I want to end. That the legislation is only effective if it is embedded in everyday decision making. You've got to have that training and awareness across all the departments, or it doesn't work. And I could say a bit more about that off camera and why it didn't work in Falkirk in these particular issues. But you do need to identify and support the champions on both sides, and think about treating your public sector equality and your socio-economic duty as being as integral as the financial and strategic considerations, and sustain that momentum, importantly, I think, through transparency, so that you can keep going on, reflecting on it, and learning from it, because it's not a static process, and we're all getting better every day. So I hope that's a lot of information, I know, trying to capture, but I hope that's helpful to you, and I'm more than happy to share things and examples later, or answer any questions. I hope that does help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure you can all see why we invited Laura Murtagh to take part in this. And I think Carole, our final speaker, is going to give us a very similar kind of looking at the challenges as well as the strength that the SED can be. We want to be really honest with folks about what this is. So thank you so much for that, Laura Murtagh. But we want to get to question and answer, so I'm going to rush quickly on to Carole Bodden, our final speaker for today. And Carole is a services manager at Gateshead Council with a focus on strategic initiatives to alleviate poverty and to tackle inequality and disadvantage. Fairly new to local authority life, Carole's career has been hugely and largely spent in the voluntary and community sector, and she enjoys bringing that perspective and experience into her role at Gateshead Council. So over to you, Carole, and thank you.
Hi everyone. I don't have any slides, which might be good for me because I haven't had to prepare them, but not so good following up. But maybe I'll do a couple and add them in so that people have got something to refer back to. So As Helen said, I'm fairly new to local authority. In fact, I started at Gateshead Council in June 2024, and implementing the social economic duty and developing an anti-poverty strategy were two key elements of the role that was given to me. And what I've learned over time, now that I'm over a year in post, that actually the links between these two and developing them and the thinking around them and the research and the data around them very much linked together. So if you're a local authority that will be adopting social economic duty because you're being forced to, perhaps it's a good time, if you haven't already, to be thinking about a strategy to address poverty as well, because you will not necessarily half your workload, but there's a lot of crossover. And so I know Resolve Poverty would agree with me, because that's a lot of stuff that they talk about in their work as well. So I was lucky in some ways that when I started, the political process around the voluntary adoption of the economic duty had already taken place. It'd been written into our health and wellbeing strategy, which was published in February 2020. And then a month later, we all know what happened in March 2020. So the delivery of that health and wellbeing strategy was obviously not quite put on hold, but had to shift due to the COVID pandemic. And then the recovery from the COVID pandemic, and then how are we dealing with the cost of living crisis? And so, you know, we'd agreed to it, but hadn't done much for a few years until I came in. So that was really, really positive for me, because I didn't have to go through all the governance processes. And I know colleagues in local authorities will understand what I mean by that. The other good bit of news for me is that when I started, there was already a move afoot to develop a new integrated impact assessment. So as a local authority, and in public health, we've been doing a lot of work about how can we embed health and well-being in all our policies, but also we've been doing work around the climate emergency and developing a climate change strategy for the council. And the integrated impact assessment was going to extend from just the equalities assessment to include health impacts, environmental impacts, and then it made complete sense to also add the social economic duty and social economic disadvantage into that. But we've only implemented it from January this year. So it's quite interesting hearing from Hackney and hearing from Scotland that they've been doing this for quite a number of years and have still got further to go on their journey. And we are very, very new to it. So we're not far ahead of those of you who aren't doing it yet. I think one thing that's quite interesting to note, slightly different maybe to what other speakers have spoken about, is that our integrated impact assessment had the dual purpose of acknowledging potential negative impacts and mitigating or removing those, but also equal emphasis on what might the positive impacts be and how can we accelerate or extend those positive impacts. And I was really pleased to see that it was both of those things. I think in terms of the first Laura's slides, in terms of the practical guide to implementing the social economic duty, we are very much clearly done stage 1. We're tinkering and doing bits and bobs around stages 2 to 5 and 6. We've got much more work to do, which is the monitoring piece and the access to justice. And I will touch upon that in a bit more detail. Last thing I want to say is just in terms of this starting bit is around linking it to the development of the anti-poverty strategy. And a lot of people have talked about the importance of data and the importance of evidence, the importance of insight from voluntary sector and insight from lived experience. And this is where I can see a real crossover of the two pieces of work, because in the development of the anti-poverty strategy, we've been doing a lot of foundational work around those things about what does the data tell us, what insights can the voluntary sector share with us around financial hardship, poverty, what makes good financial well-being, etc. And we've also started engagement with people with lived experience to kind of help us with our initial thinking around the development of the strategy. So we're very much in the phase 1 approach. But now I'm thinking about, well, we've gathered all of that insights and data. How can we utilize that now that the new integrated impact assessment is bedding in to help other people with their assessments around social economic duty? So I'm going to go straight into now some of the learning and challenges. I think the first one on my list is communication is key, and communicating that it's coming, how you're going to deal with it, what the processes are, both across officers who will be preparing and doing impact assessments, but also councillors who will be receiving them, and that will obviously support that move to the new tool. I think it's really important that there's an emphasis on why this is beyond a tick box exercise, and some of the stuff that Laura from Falkirk was saying around, this can really make an impact. It's about making better decisions based on evidence and insights that will either, will mean that we'll get better outcomes for our residents. Now, that's a much more appealing story to tell than it's another form for you to fill in, which is how some people may receive it. I think a key challenge is, despite communications that we did over a period of time, warming up, we had kind of service champions, stuff on the newsletter, rolling banners on the intranet, all of those things. We found 9 months later, in September, a report had got all the way to Cabinet, and a full new integrated impact assessment hadn't been done on it. And a few of us that were involved in impact assessments were like, how on earth did this happen? It had gone through several layers of meetings and checks and balances, and yet it got all the way to Cabinet. They had done an impact assessment, but it was the old tool, not the new one, which wasn't as robust and hadn't covered all the new areas. And so, even with good communication, getting those things bedded in can be more of a challenge than you would think. So there can never be too much communication and governance around this stuff. I think, again, Laura made this point, and it's something that we've been really clear about, that I think in previous times, or over in historic times, impact assessments were often done as part of a governance process towards the end of, right, this is going here now, we need to do an impact assessment. And it may vary from light touch to in-depth, but we're very much taking the approach that this is a tool that you can use throughout the cycle of a project development or a proposal development to inform the development and ultimately end up with a better decision. But if you use it right from the very planning stages, you can then identify, as Laura said, actually, we do need more evidence about this. We do need to do more engagement with lived experience because we don't have all the evidence, and so can improve a project or proposal even before any decisions are made on it, just because it kind of indicates the approach or gaps that you have. However, all of that makes it sound that everything's rosy, but it hasn't all been rosy, because what we are now seeing is that the integrated impact assessments that have been done, some are brilliant, don't get me wrong, but some are less brilliant in terms of use of data, use of evidence, engagement with people with lived experience. And there's a real concern for me around, if the person doing the impact assessment is also the person that's putting forward a paper with a set of recommendations for a decision, is there actually a bit of a conflict of interest there? And so, yeah, there's lots of questions that need to be asked. And I think for me, the next stage of the rollout, like we've been doing it for a few months now, we're getting to the how can we iterate, how can we make it better, is about how can we support the use of data and evidence, how can we support engagement with people with lived experience so it becomes much more robust. In terms of, just finally, the last section I want to touch upon is questions that we're still grappling with and next steps that we're intending to take. So there's a lot of a debate linking to what I just said before, is how are we quality assuring, policing, challenging, reviewing impact assessments that are taking place? Whose role is it to do that? And one of the thoughts that I put forward is, at the very least, we should have somebody outside of a service area carrying out a peer review to reduce any bias that may be within that. because of people coming from a particular perspective, I suppose, as a starting point for that review thing, and then looking how can we make it more robust again and again and again. I think also as a council, we've been clear that because we've adopted this voluntarily, we've gone above and beyond just using it for strategic decisions and trying to ensure that we're using it across all aspects of our council's work, around operational decisions, around approaches, around funding, all of those sorts of things. But again, that very much takes time. And making the links between the health in all policies and social economic disadvantage being a key driver for health inequalities, and using that so that we can consolidate and consolidate those messages. So when we're talking about one thing, we talk about the other. Leadership has been talked about a lot, and we have a new lead for poverty in our council, who is the deputy leader, so that's quite helpful to us. And they're very keen that they will review all papers that go to all the portfolios to give that sort of poverty, social disadvantage lens to it, but also wanting to take more of a role in terms of reviewing, challenging and championing social economic disadvantage and impact assessments. That's really good. I mentioned right at the very start that number 6 on the practical guide to implementing the social economic duty is, I think, the area that we need to concentrate most on, which is around monitoring impact and compliance. And I'm really keen to try and understand, well, what difference has this made? And I really love Laura's example of the budget and the discussions and the communications that was around that, to say, no, this really did make a difference to people's lives, and it gave good reason for making difficult decisions for the benefit of the communities in Falkirk. And the last thing we're grappling with is how might we embed the social economic duty or consideration of social economic disadvantage in decisions that have already happened. So it's all well and good moving forward, but we are aware that there are practices and processes in the council, policies and procedures that may be having a negative impact that haven't been through this process. So there's a question of how do we go back and how do we champion addressing those so that we are doing everything in our power to reduce social economic disadvantage. And I think I'm going to stop there and give people 2 minutes back for more questions.
Absolutely a masterclass. Thank you so much, Carole. And just such a great and such an honest run through from both Laura and Carole there. And I think that's what we really asked them for, and hopefully that's incredibly useful. So firstly, thank you to our incredible speakers. Thank you to each and every one of them. I personally have felt that this has been so incredibly useful, and I like to think I know a thing or two about the socio-economic duty, but I'm going to one thing I should say, we're going to stop recording now. So I will stop that.